During my college winter break, I decided to visit my cousins in a small town in Vermont. The town was quiet, blanketed in snow, and offered a much-needed escape from my busy college life. Little did I know this trip would turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. One night, my cousins and I went to a friend's house, located in a remote area surrounded by dense, dark forests. We had a great time, laughing and sharing stories. As the night wore on, I decided to head back to my cousin's house alone. "I'll be fine," I assured them. "It's just a short walk through the woods." Bundled up in my heavy coat, gloves, and hat, I set off. The snow crunched under my boots with each step, and the cold air stung my face. The path was familiar. We had taken this shortcut through the forest many times, saving about 10 minutes compared to the main road. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around me. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick branches, and my breath formed small clouds in the chilly air. The only sounds were the occasional howl of the wind and the crunch of snow beneath my feet. Suddenly, I noticed a figure standing on the path ahead. It startled me. I didn't expect to see anyone else out here. The figure was tall and wore a dark coat. As I got closer, I saw that they were wearing a ski mask, with only their eyes visible. "Hey," I called out, waving. The person didn't respond. They just stood there silently staring at me. A chill ran down my spine, and a sense of dread washed over me. Who was this person? And why were they just standing there? My heart began to race. I considered turning back to my friend's house, but I was already halfway home. Trying to stay calm, I quickened my pace and walked past the person, keeping my eyes forward. I could feel their gaze on me, and my steps grew faster. The forest seemed darker, the path narrower, and every sound made me jump. I heard footsteps behind me. My blood ran cold. I didn't dare look back. I just kept moving faster. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I was sure they were following me. I broke into a run, my lungs burning from the cold air, my legs feeling heavy. But I couldn't stop. The footsteps matched my pace, getting closer and closer. In the distance, I saw the lights of my cousin's house. Desperation pushed me harder, and I sprinted towards the safety of home. Terrifying thoughts raced through my mind about what might happen if they caught me. Finally, I burst out of the forest and into the yard. The footsteps stopped. I glanced back but saw no one. The path was empty, just dark trees and shadows. I rushed to the door, pounding on it with all my strength, my breath coming in gasps. My cousin opened the door, his face full of concern. "What's wrong?" he asked, seeing the fear in my eyes. "Someone was in the forest," I managed to say between breaths. "They were following me." My cousins quickly checked outside but found nothing. The path was empty, and the forest was quiet again. They tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just someone else heading home, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump, and I kept seeing the man in the ski mask, standing silently in the forest, his cold eyes staring at me. The next morning, I vowed never to take that path again. The experience haunted me for the rest of my break. Even now, thinking about it sends chills down my spine. I wonder who that man was and what he wanted. Why was he out there, and why did he follow me? I'll never know. But one thing is certain, I don't plan to go back to that forest path anytime soon. What was supposed to be a relaxing break with family turned into a nightmare. The quiet, snowy town in Vermont now holds a dark, scary memory for me. And the forest, once just a shortcut, is now a place of fear and mystery. A few years back when I was 16, I had an experience that still haunts me to this day. It was one of those warm summer nights when my friend and I would sneak out with a pack of cigarettes and a bottle of beer each, trying to enjoy our little rebellion away from the prying eyes of our small town. Living in a place where everyone knows everyone, the only way to indulge in such activities without our parents finding out was to hide away in the nearby forest. That night, like many others, We set off with our flashlights, our contraband hidden in our pockets. We took the familiar path through the long meadow that led to the edge of the forest. At the meeting point of the meadow and the forest stood an old gazebo with a fireplace, a popular spot for picnics during the day, but eerily deserted at night. We stopped several times as we crossed the meadow, scanning the gazebo from a distance to make sure it was empty. It was around 11 p.m., and the darkness was so thick that even in the open meadow, we had to use our flashlights to see anything. Assured that the coast was clear, we approached the gazebo and lit our first cigarette. Standing there, we puffed away, chatting quietly while our flashlights probed the darkness around us. After about 5 minutes, we decided it was time to head back to town through the forest path, a steep downhill walk that usually took around 20 minutes. We had barely walked 30 meters into the forest when it happened. From the gazebo where we had just been standing, we heard a blood-curdling scream. It was the kind of scream that freezes your blood and turns your stomach. It sounded like a man, and it was as if he was being tortured. The agony in his voice was unmistakable. There was a brief pause, just long enough for us to exchange terrified glances, before the scream came again, louder and even more horrifying. That second scream broke our paralysis. Without a word, we turned and ran as fast as we could through the rough forest terrain, not daring to look back. The adrenaline was pumping so hard that all I could hear was my heartbeat thundering in my ears. We sprinted until we saw the welcoming lights of the town. Collapsing onto a sidewalk under a street lamp, we sat there panting, our minds racing. For a good 30 minutes we were silent, too shaken to speak. Eventually, we began to talk about what had happened, trying to make sense of it. We theorized that someone might have been playing a cruel prank on us, or worse, someone was genuinely in danger. Determined to find out, we decided to go back to the gazebo the next morning. To our surprise, there was no sign of any struggle, no evidence that anyone had been hurt. It was as if the night before had been a twisted figment of our imagination. We concluded, reluctantly, that it must have been a prank, though the thought didn't sit well with either of us. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong that night. We had been standing at the gazebo for quite a while, so whoever had been there must have been hiding very well. It seemed impossible that anyone could sneak up on us in that darkness without any light. And if they had used a torch, we surely would have seen it. To this day, the memory gnaws at me. The eerie feeling, the inexplicable screams, and the dark, silent forest have left a permanent mark on my mind. Whoever or whatever was out there, I hope we never meet again. When I was around 12, my parents occasionally left town for a weekend getaway, leaving my siblings and me in the care of our Uncle Ron. Uncle Ron, a lifelong bachelor, adored kids and eagerly took on the role of babysitter. One Friday evening, as a heavy snowstorm blanketed the town, we all gathered to watch Titanic. Me, my 2 brothers, my older sister, and Uncle Ron. The night was a mixture of vivid memories and blurred moments. During one of the most intense scenes in the movie, the power flickered, briefly turning off the VCR. After a bit of fumbling, we managed to get back to where we had left off. Not long after, Uncle Ron dozed off on the couch. We let him sleep while we continued watching, engrossed in the story. At that moment, my brother returned from the bathroom, having taken a detour outside to marvel at the snowfall. He burst back in, shouting for us to check out something unusual. Curiosity piqued, we followed him to the back door. There, in the freshly fallen snow, were clear footprints leading from the door to the window and then back toward the woods. The sight of these footprints was unsettling, but it was even more unnerving when my brother mentioned hearing the doorknob turn. My sister, being the oldest, freaked out and ran inside, while my brothers and I, driven by a mix of fear and excitement, decided to investigate further. Despite our sister's protests and threats to wake Uncle Ron, we convinced her it would be fun and assured her we wouldn't venture far. She reluctantly went back to the living room as we bundled up and stepped out into the storm. The footprints led us deeper into the forest, and as we followed, they seemed to grow fresher, possibly due to the tree cover reducing the snowfall. After what felt like an eternity, the footprints led us to a hidden cabin in the woods. It was dark, with no light emanating from within. The footsteps ended at the front door, but we didn't dare approach it. Instead, we crept to a nearby window, only to find it wasn't glass, but just a screen. As we peered inside, we heard two heavy thumps and a dragging sound from within the cabin, though we couldn't see the source. Suddenly, one of my brothers screamed, pointing at another window where we saw a dark figure's head peering out. It was so shadowy that we couldn't make out any features. The head disappeared, followed by frantic noises inside, and then the front door burst open. We screamed and bolted back toward the house, retracing our steps as fast as we could. The next morning, we tried to lead Uncle Ron back to the cabin, but to our disbelief, we couldn't find it. Even after numerous attempts and scouring maps and Google Earth, the cabin seemed to have vanished. If it weren't for my brothers, I might have doubted my own memory of that eerie night. To this day, we still live in the same house, and that mysterious cabin remains a haunting enigma, one that we never found again, a shadow in our shared history. Living in a small town on the edge of the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina has its perks, including the vast expanse of forest just a stone's throw away. For my 18th birthday, my mom suggested we take a hike in the nearby national forest. While I loved the outdoors, the forest had a reputation that made me hesitate. It was known for its illegal activities, mostly moonshine stills and unlicensed logging. Plus, there were stories of bodies being found there, some dating back decades. Despite my initial reluctance, my mom assured me that we'd be safe. After all, we weren't involved in anything shady, so why would anyone bother us? Besides, the forest was enormous, and the likelihood of running into trouble was slim. We chose a cloudy day in early spring, hoping to avoid any other hikers. We started our hike at the northwestern trailhead, weaving through patches of wildflowers and dense groves of pine trees. After the first mile, we entered the thickest part of the forest. The ground was muddy, and the only sound was the squelching of our boots. But then I heard something else. Footsteps that seemed to echo ours, but from above. I glanced up at the canopy, but saw nothing. Trying to shrug it off as an animal, I kept walking. A short while later, I heard whispers, low and indistinct. I tried to ignore them, convincing myself that it was just the wind. But the feeling of being watched lingered. We passed a stagnant pond on our left, its surface unnervingly still, surrounded by a tangle of dead reeds. On our right, the forest was impenetrable, with narrow trails disappearing into the gloom. We reached a small waterfall, and my mom busied herself with taking photos. I scanned the area, and that's when I saw him. A tall, thin figure in ragged clothes, darting across the trail and vanishing into the trees. The sight was so fleeting that I barely had time to react before he was gone. Mom decided we should head back, and as we retraced our steps, we found a neatly arranged pile of pine cones in the middle of the trail, pointing the way we had come. It was odd, especially since we hadn't seen anyone else all day. My mom dismissed it as nothing, but I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me. As we walked back, the forest seemed to grow darker, and every rustle in the underbrush set my nerves on edge. When we finally broke through the tree line and saw our car, I breathed a sigh of relief. The unease of that hike lingered long after we returned home. Despite my mom's calm demeanor, I couldn't forget the sight of that stranger, and the eerie feeling that followed us. It was a stark reminder that even the most beautiful places could hold hidden dangers, and some paths are best left unexplored.